Hello everyone, welcome to session 5 of module 5, Risk and Testing. In this session we will learn about different types of risks, levels of risks, and how to manage risks in software testing. So risk is the possibility of a negative or undesirable outcome. It is something which has not happened yet, but it is a possibility that it might happen in future. Any undesirable or negative outcome might happen in future. So risk has the likelihood between 0 to 100%. It is something which may happen. It has not happened, but it may happen in future, and it has a likelihood. It can never happen, 0% likelihood, or it is very certain that it will happen. So there is a likelihood of the risk in your project. So the likelihood of risk becoming an outcome is one factor to consider when prioritizing the risk. More likely the outcome, the worse the risk. So based on the likelihood of risk, so there is a scale from 0 to 100%. So if the risk is more likelihood to happen, then when you are prioritizing the risk, then it is most likely that the high likelihood risk need to be considered, need to be mitigated, because they might be the worst risks. So risks can be classified as product risks or project risks. So we'll understand what product risks are and what project risks are in future slides. So what are the product risks? So possibility that the system software might fail to satisfy users' expectation is known as product risk. So product not able to fulfill end users' expectation is a product risk. So any risk associated with the product that you are delivering, with the software that you are delivering, is a product risk. Then product risks are sometimes also referred to as quality risks, because it's the risk of the quality. The quality of the product is down, because of that the product risks arise. So they are also referred to as quality risks, as they are risks related to the quality of the software product. So unsatisfactory software might not fulfill end user needs. So because of low quality product, it might not be able to fulfill end user needs, and it might not be able to satisfy the end user. So non-functional product risk can be like security, reliability, usability, maintainability, or performance of the software. So product risk you can classify as functional and non-functional as well. So based on functional characteristics, it might be, so suppose you are developing a banking software, banking application. So functional, there might be functional risks and non-functional risks. So in non-functional, the application doesn't respond well. It takes a long time to load the banking application. Whenever you do a transaction, it takes a long time to do the transaction, to process the transaction. So these are kind of non-functional product risks. Functional risks are anything, so like you are not able to add a new user or new beneficiary to which you can pay. So these are some of the functional risks that a product can have. So what is risk-based testing? So in risk-based testing, we organize our testing efforts in such fashion that it reduces the level of product risk at the time of shipment. So in risk-based testing, your focus is more towards you identify different risks in the product, and then you prioritize your testing according to the risks and try to reduce the risks as more as you can. So risk-based testing uses risk to prioritize the appropriate test cases during project. So based on the risk, you prioritize your test cases in the risk-based testing. Then it starts early in the project cycle. Risk-based testing starts very early in the project cycle. The risks to system quality are identified, and that knowledge is used in the test planning, preparation, and execution. So based on the risk of the product, so you first identify what are the risks with delivering the software or the system, and then based on that knowledge you do all your test planning, preparation, and execution activity. So you prioritize the risk, you know the risk of the software, and then you do a planning according to that. You prioritize those risks, you do planning to execute high priority risk first, and prepare the test cases, execute those test cases first in order to reduce the likelihood, reduce the risk, the high priority risks from the release. Risk-based testing involves both mitigation and contingency. So risk-based testing involves mitigation and contingency. We'll understand these about mitigation contingency in next slide. So what is mitigation and contingency? Mitigation is done to reduce the likelihood of defects. So if you are reducing the likelihood of defects, that is known as mitigation. Then contingency, in case if the risk becomes an outcome, there should be a plan to reduce the risk impact. So in mitigation, what you do is, if there is a high priority risk, high likelihood risk, then you try to mitigate by doing more testing around that, by having a more extensive list of test cases which you execute, which ensure that the released module is of high quality, which reduces the likelihood of defects in production. So that's mitigation. And contingency, so contingency is something which you, in case the risk becomes a likelihood, so you ensure that even if this will occur in future in production, then it will have minimal impact. It won't have too much impact, so it will reduce the impact. Then what are the techniques for risk-based testing? So risk-based testing starts with product risk analysis. So risk analysis is the first phase in risk-based testing. So you do product risk analysis. So some techniques for risk analysis are: you read the requirements design documents thoroughly and closely. You read each and every requirement and what the impact of the requirement, what's the priority of the requirement is, and based on that requirement, the priority and design design documents, you prioritize the risks accordingly. Then you do brainstorming with many project holders. So you do a brainstorming session with different project holders to understand which are the most important requirements to be fulfilled, and kind of high risk requirements are being finalized. Then small group or one-on-one sessions with business and technology experts in organizations. This is another technique which is used. So you do one-on-one sessions with technology experts in the organization or with the business experts to understand which is the most important feature or most important requirement that needs to be implemented according to them and is of high risk in case it fails to operate properly after the release. So based on all this thorough understanding, meetings, brainstorming with project holder, you prioritize your risk. You do a risk analysis first. Then in order to avoid the missing things, it's always a good idea to have a checklist of functional and non-functional areas which you should consider for risk analysis. So you cannot just go ahead in a meeting and do a brainstorming without doing a preparation. So before doing any analysis or meeting or brainstorming or one-on-one session, planning is the most important thing. So in planning, in risk-based testing, in planning, what you will do is you will first have a kind of checklist. You will plan a checklist of functional and non-functional areas for the software system that you are delivering. What kind of functional and non-functional areas you need to discuss with different stakeholders and prioritize the risk accordingly or do risk analysis accordingly. So some of them can be like functionality, localization, usability, reliability, performance, and supportability. So these are some of the areas or some of the functional and non-functional characteristics that you need to have in your checklist before going ahead and discussing having brainstorming session and group discussion session, one-on-one sessions with business and technology experts. Then here is a basic risk analysis template that you can use. So it is based on the categories, different categories. So category 1, what is the likelihood, what is the impact, priority, and what is the mitigation plan for that. So based on the categories, you can have risk 1, risk 2. You can just keep writing down the risks based on the categories. Then you can decide on the likelihood based on the discussions and brainstorming sessions that happen. You can note down the impact, the priority accordingly in this template, which will help in future test planning and execution activities. So based on the likelihood and impact, you can prioritize high risk stories or high risk requirements on the top, which will be executed in initial test phases and which will be tested thoroughly in the test phases. So what are the so we have discussed product risks. So now let's understand what are project risks. So as we understood that product risk is any risk associated with the product or software that you are delivering. Project risk is the project overall process or project risk that is associated with the software development life cycle kind of process or resources or management of the project. So some common project risks for testing are as follows. For example, test item not getting installed in test environment. So this is a project risk. Test items not getting installed in the test environment, which will delay the testing. So mitigated through smoke testing prior to starting testing phase. So for example, you got a build that is not being successfully installed in the test environment. So that is a project risk because your planned test execution will get delayed. So this can be mitigated through proper smoke testing prior to starting test phase. So if in entry criteria of your test plan you mention that the build or test item should pass smoke testing prior to starting testing phase, this will get mitigated. Then incomplete or unrealistic test environment. So if the test environment is unrealistic, is set up incorrectly or incomplete, that is another project risk because the test results that you will get will not be correct. And you cannot even proceed if the test environment is incomplete. You cannot proceed with the testing, which will delay the project schedule again. So that's another project risk. So this can lead to misleading test results. For this, outsourcing can be done, for example, performance testing. So if you do not have in-house expertise for doing test environment setup for specialized testing like performance testing, this can be mitigated by doing an outsourcing. So you can outsource performance testing of your application to other organization. Then major change in software. If there are major changes in the software which may delay the overall project schedule, so this can be mitigated by good change control process, a robust test design, and lightweight test documentation. So that's another kind of risk to the project. Then organizational issues can also happen. For example, shortage of staff. If you require 10 testers and there are only 5 available, obviously the test cycle has to be either double the planned cycle, or you need to have more staff to finish testing in specified timeline. Then you have shortage of skills or training. So suppose you are doing database testing and your team doesn't have database testing skills, then that's another training requirement that you need to consider if there is shortage of skills. And problems with communicating and responding test results, that's another very common project risk, that improper communication between team members and responding to test results and defects. So that's another very common project risk that can happen in the project. Then any technical problems for any ambiguous or unprioritized requirement is another risk to the project, because you cannot go ahead and start working on any ambiguous unprioritized requirement unless and until requirements are very clear from business stakeholders, from technical high technical people. You cannot go ahead and start implementing those requirements in the product. Then if there are excessive requirements to be implemented in very less time frame, that is another project issue. Definitely you won't be able to implement all those requirements in the project. So if there are excessive requirements, that's another issue. Either you need more time to implement those requirements, or you need to discard some of the requirement in order to meet the project schedule. Then high system complexity. So if the system is very complex, for example, banking or superannuation industry systems are very complex, which require a lot of technical and calculation skills. So those kind of system are complex system which require very specialized staff or domain expertise in that field. So if the system is complex, that and the staff that is working on those features is not very well aware of how the system works, then it might be another kind of risk to the project. And then finally, quality problem with design, code, or test. So if the software design is not proper, there are quality issues with design or testing or any coding done, then that's another project risk, because you will find many defects during test cycles, and since there will be many defects and a lot of time will be consumed by developers to fix those issues, and again by the testers to verify those issues, so that will again push the timeline, because there are many defects which need to be worked on by the developers. These are some of the project risks that you need to consider for any project. So what is risk management? Let's understand what is risk management. So process of identifying the risk, be it the product or project risks, analyze the risk and then mitigating the risk or controlling the risk is known as risk management. So risk management is nothing but first you identify the risk, product or project risk, then analyze it, and finally you mitigate it or control it by some techniques. So this whole process, identification, analyzing and mitigating, is known as risk management. So risk management includes three main activities. What are those? Risk identification, risk analysis, and risk mitigation or controlling the risk. These are three main activities in risk management. Risk management activities provide a disciplined approach to assess what can go wrong in system or software, which risks are important to deal with, and implement action plan to deal with those risks. So risk management activities provide very disciplined approach to assess what can go wrong in the system, then which are more important risks to deal, which are less important, and then after doing the prioritizing activities for the risk, you implement an action plan to deal with those risks. So let's understand the risk management activities one by one. So what is risk identification? Risk identification is the first step in risk management. We need to identify both project and product risk by using certain techniques. So in risk identification phase, you identify product and project risks by using the some techniques. And some of the most common techniques which can be applied to identify risks are using risk templates that we discussed in previous slides. So you can have a risk template based on different functional and non-functional characteristics of software, and then you can do one-on-one sessions. You can interview stakeholders, different project stakeholders, high technical members of the team, domain experts in the organization, and understand what are the most common kind of risks for the user stories or the requirements that you want to implement in the project. So in the risk identification, you should have a template first with all the major functional, non-functional risk factors that you want to discuss, and then with interviewing, with one-on-one sessions, you can figure out different risk and identify different risks in the project or product. Then in the risk analysis is the next step in the risk management. And what you do is in risk analysis, you study the risks identified in the identification phase and assign the level of risk to each item. So once you have identified different functional and non-functional risks in the from the requirements by discussing with different stakeholders and technology experts of the organization, then in the analysis phase, you analyze different risks and identify the level of risk for each risk item. You first need to categorize the risk and then need to determine the level of risk, specifying likelihood and impact of the risk. So in the risk identification template, there are columns for likelihood and impact. So once you have identified all the risks, the second phase is to analyze and determine the level and likelihood or impact of the risk. So this is also done by discussing with different stakeholders in the team. Then the third task is risk mitigation and control. So third step in risk management is mitigation or risk control. After assessing the risk in your project, you must control them. So controlling a risk or mitigating a risk is the most important step in risk management. You can use options like mitigation, contingency, or to control the risk. So you can use mitigation contingency to control the risk. So mitigation is to take steps in advance to reduce the likelihood and impact of the risk. So you mitigate. So for example, there is high likelihood of risk to happen, so you take advanced steps to test that module rigorously. You focus on that module more, you have more set of test cases and more testers testing that module, so that the likelihood and the impact of the failure is not much whenever in case that module fails. So that's the first step you can take to control the risk. Then you can prepare a contingency plan to reduce the impact in case the risk becomes an outcome. So the second control option is to have a contingency plan. So in case risk becomes an outcome, the impact should be low as compared to the high impact. Then you can also transfer the risk to another member of the team or project or stakeholders to reduce the likelihood or accept the impact of the risk. So transferring a risk is another kind of control mechanism. For example, if you do not have a team to do proper performance testing, you do not have skill set in your team to do performance testing, so you transfer the performance testing task or risk to, you outsource it to other teams. So it gets transferred to other, either to the outsourced organization or to other specialized team in your organization. Then you ignore the last option. You do not do anything about the risk. It's only advisable if the impact of the risk is very low. So if the impact is very low, then you can just ignore the risk and avoid it. So to conclude, in this session, we learned about what is a risk, then what are product and project risks, then finally then techniques for risk-based testing, and then finally risk management. And we understood about risk identification, analysis, and mitigation or risk control. Thank you.